Great. Well, I guess we'll just get into it and see what comes out of it. So hello, everybody. My name's Aaron. I'm going to be hosting this episode of the Dharma Gates podcast. Dharma Gates is an organization that is working to connect people through different opportunities, a variety of different ways into traditions of Buddhist practice and meditation. We hope to highlight voices from different communities, lineages of practice, and give a variety of ways in for people who might be encountering these traditions and not know how to orient. And so today I have a friend and a fellow practitioner here at Great Vow Zen Monastery, Patrick Kennyo Dunn, who is a ordained Zen priest, coming up on the end of his 5-year period of sort of committed formal training here. And also Kennyo was considering going a more academic route before he moved into the sort of formal contemplative training. And so we were having a conversation last week about the sort of interactions between academia and contemplative communities and practice, and the very interesting scene that's happening in that dialogue right now. And so I just thought it would be nice to have a time to share a few of those thoughts that we were looking into in that conversation, and reflect on it in a way that might be available to others in case they were interested in what someone like Kennyo would have to say here. So that's a little bit of the context for this, but for now, I was wondering if you might start by sharing a little bit about your background and how you ended up here, how you ended up as Kennyo, and this is very hard to do, but what's it been like for you?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Thanks for organizing this. I do hope it will be helpful. I've had a really kind of winding path, and my life has been shaped by a lot of different forces. And I've come into contact with a lot of different kind of worlds. One of them certainly has been the academic world. Well, when I was a teenager, I had psychedelic experiences and other experiences that, really opened up my mind in ways that I didn't fully understand at the time. But I think those were crucial events in kind of orienting me towards deeper spiritual questions. I was also connected with countercultural things, interested in Beat Generation writers, and like many people, kind of encountering the American and modern countercultural revival and adaptation of Buddhist traditions. And that stirred my interest. And of course, I just had basic spiritual questions, as people do. And, my family was kind of intellectually oriented, and I was a pretty intellectual person. So I read lots of books, and eventually ended up studying philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. I grew up in the Pittsburgh area. And that turned out to be a pretty interesting place to be. I think it was my second year in college. I was in a really excellent seminar on Chan and Zen. And that opened me up to the literature of the tradition, and opened me up to the scriptures and the traditional sources of teaching. And I also had the opportunity to learn Zazen to visit a Zen center and receive instruction from a Zen priest. So that was a kind of initiatory moment in some ways. And I continued to pursue this academically because that was kind of just the path that I was on at the time. But I was always driven by existential questions and just deep, basic questions. So as I continued, I ended up writing this incredibly long and in some ways ambitious bachelor's thesis about the transmission of Zen Buddhism into the modern world. Let me turn some light on. I just realized I'm
getting a little darker over there.
yes.
Yeah, that looks better.
Yeah. So I wrote this thesis and started thinking about continuing work in Buddhist studies, and was thinking about PhD programs, and was studying Sanskrit, studying Tibetan, and ended up at the University of Chicago Divinity School, intending to work in the realm of Buddhist studies, but realized that that wasn't really my interest in Buddhism, that it didn't feel authentic, and it just wasn't really connecting with my heart to be engaging with Buddhism in that way. I was interested in kind of all the questions that scholars ask, and the whole field of the history of religions really fascinated me, and I connected intellectually with that discipline and with that tradition. That was part of what led me to the University of Chicago, the very interesting kind of legacy there in the study of religion. But I just didn't feel at home doing that, and was not satisfied, and ended up transferring into the philosophy department, and eventually completed all the requirements for the PhD in philosophy except for the dissertation. And I fled ABD, as they say, all the dissertation, and had some difficult years after that. And it was a while before I found my way into a community of practice. That's what I really never had before that, was a supportive community of practitioners. And I resisted that in many ways. And it took some serious crises and kind of failures and wrong turns to end up here at Great Vow.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm curious now. The next obvious question is, what was it like, or what was your first encounter with the Buddhism as it's practiced, and how did that land for you in your system, in your life, and what was it that brought you to where you are now, which is being a long-term monastic here?
Yeah, throughout the years of my kind of intense intellectual engagement, I found lots of ways of kind of thinking myself out of this basic vow, this basic calling that I always knew was there, but there were so many questions, I think really relevant and real questions surrounding that I was always able to kind of evade the call. And really one of the precipitating events that very directly led me to come and do sesshin, first at Zen Mountain Monastery in New York, and then I came out here to Oregon, was my cat died. My cat, Emerson, who had been with me for 7 years through thick and thin, died of lymphoma, and I was with him through the dying process, and there was something touched in that experience that was real in a way that I couldn't deny. That encounter with death and with with life, with the preciousness of life, and just the intimacy of that experience kind of opened something up for me and helped me to find the courage to take the step, which was really a step into the unknown, because there was I had no kind of rationale, no solid rationale for leaving the life that I was in and pursuing full-time residential spiritual practice. But there was a knowing that was deeper than all of the reasons and all of the arguments that my mind marshaled forth. So yeah, and coming here was really a struggle. And my first sesshin at Zen Mountain Monastery was excruciating. I mean, I spent the entire week just arguing against the experience. And by the end of it, I really thought that, okay, I'm done with this. I've thought myself out of this. I don't need this. You know, this, what they're calling dukkha is just imaginary, and it's not something that I really have to face. I can escape this great matter. And it wasn't so. I left there and, you know, went back home and found that I was just sitting in meditation every day and reading the Mahayana scriptures, and you know, something had really been opened up, something quite mysterious. So it was an experience of encountering mystery and also encountering faith in myself, something that I didn't acknowledge before that. I maybe I knew was there on some level, but I was not consciously recognizing this kind of faith that was living within me.
Great, yeah. And now you've been here for quite a while, and I suppose you could share a little bit about how that first sesshin led to 9 years now in this community, and what it's been like to kind of sink into community and into the practice in this sort of long-term way that not very many people in American culture really do. And so it's a little bit of a unique thing to be an American monastic in this tradition that's so recently arrived and still in this state of exploration of what it is here. So if you have any reflections there, I'd love to hear that. I know that could be its own series of podcasts, but
Yeah, many people probably know that the ordination tradition in Japanese Zen Buddhism is unique in the world of Buddhism. It's not a Vinaya-based form of ordination. So there's no vow of celibacy. We don't make a commitment to follow the many hundreds of rules of the traditional monastic code, the Vinaya. We do take vows, very important vows, including vows of simplicity and most importantly, vows to awaken and to be of service. But it's a distinct tradition in terms of what it means to be a priest, what it means to be ordained in this tradition. And it's true that this way of life is not conventional in our society, for sure. But it's also important to acknowledge that this isn't the renunciant life of a monastic who is following the Vinaya tradition. So it's in a way, it's kind of a hybrid life. It's not fully a lay life or a householder life, but it's also not a cloistered monastic life of total renunciation. So, we try to have a balanced, integrated approach here. Even so, the experience of coming here and staying here has been challenging all along, for sure, and there's been a kind of grief associated with it, and probably to some extent this is something that is just part of the spiritual path, that all of the kind of agendas and self-absorptions and projects and narratives that we were ensconced in our lives are deconstructed and are stripped away and are exposed as tenuous and in some ways just don't seem as interesting. And so as we kind of divest from all of that, there is a loss that comes with that. And deciding to be here, continuing full-time monastic practice was a kind of immersion in that process of loss and transformation. And so, one could do that in a more gradual kind of piecemeal fashion. But, for whatever reason, for me, I came here and I just stayed here. And, every day, every moment, it's a commitment that has to be renewed. And it continues to flow from this basic sense of faith, or this basic knowing that really can't be articulated and that I can't quite identify or rationalize, but there's a confidence, a trust that continues to reveal itself when the going gets tough. In the times when I really feel like, okay, I'm out of here, I can't do this anymore. That trust somehow reappears, and it's not that it would be bad if I left or anything like that, but that trust is really what has kept me going.
Yeah, very, very. I often have thoughts of what would it really be like to settle in for a long time, and it might be a part of my future. So it's always interesting to hear that, the sort of reflections on the sort of long-term staying with of the practice. And I wanted to turn to the topic, the title you suggested for this episode was Dharma Between Worlds, and what you meant by that, and what's alive for you in that, and maybe that's a reflection on the sort of movement from the academic space into the practice space, and yeah, what was coming to you when you were thinking of that topic?
Partly I was thinking about my own kind of position, and I'm not a transmitted teacher. I'm not planning to be a monastic for the rest of my life. And, so I feel like there are people who, have really mastered their lineage traditions and have received that transmission and fully embody it, like maybe some of the people that you interviewed before, like Gwogu and Meido Moore and people like that, Lama Tsultrim, and I have a lot of respect for those people, but I'm recognizing increasingly that that may not be my path, my role in all of this. So it's partly recognizing that I'm in this kind of interstitial, liminal kind of position in relation to all of this. And perhaps part of my work is to synthesize and kind of see how these different realms fit together and integrate. And I also feel like we're living in a time when that is really important, that what's happening with the evolution of the Buddhist tradition now, and maybe this has always been the case, which is something interesting to consider, but that, it's not a one-dimensional tradition. And, I think often we find ourselves entangled in discourses that are reductive and that kind of present one side to the exclusion of other sides. And I encountered that in academia to some extent, that there's a lot of energy that goes into ideological critique and analyzing structures of power, relations of power as they operate in religious institutions and in religious contexts, and uncovering kind of genealogies of power, and in many ways calling into question the claims of authority that are made from within the spiritual lineages themselves. And that's, all of that is really important. It's really important to call attention to the structures of power that often go hidden and unacknowledged in the realm of religion. But if that's the only approach, and if there's a belief that perspective somehow negates the value of meditation, for example, if we think that meditation is just a kind of fascination of Buddhist modernism and really can be kind of drained of its value if we can see it in that context and see how it's been kind of historically misappropriated in the post-colonial age. That can actually that can cast doubt on spiritual practice for people, which isn't so helpful. And on the other side of it, from within the spiritual traditions, that perspective, the perspective of seeing relations of power, seeing how rhetoric and ideology are operating in religious discourse, seeing how historical conditions have shaped the assumptions and the ideas that we have about Buddhism and about spirituality. For example, colonialism and even just kind of white privilege within North American culture, for example. and its role in kind of the Buddhist subculture. From within the spiritual traditions, there can be a tendency to just kind of be blind to all of that, and to dismiss all of that and say, well, that's not practice. That's not relevant to practice. Really to kind of absolutize the point of view of the spiritual phenomenology, and of, all there is my direct experience. And so, this other point of view that kind of sees intersubjective conditions and sees kind of larger historical forces, that point of view just doesn't have a place in spiritual practice. And that's not very helpful, actually, and actually can also be dangerous. So yeah, that was part of it. And, there are other things happening too that are really interesting just in our world today. We're living in a time of transition, of extraordinary, critical transition, and, ecological crisis. For the past 5 years, there's a kind of disclosure of previously hidden information about government involvement in UFO technology, and very interesting things happening around that. And there's a psychedelic renaissance underway where entheogenic plant medicines and psychedelic compounds are now being distributed on a widespread scale and becoming part of the conventional medical establishment, and for better and worse, probably being assimilated into the medical model of our time, being used as medicine. And I think all of those things and other things are having transformative effects, and are influencing our attitudes about spiritual practice, and are important to be aware of when we're engaging in practice.
I liked what you said a lot about the sort of, I think, softening rigidity around ways of engaging, or ways of seeing what engagement is, or monasticism is, or I think one of the things we've been trying and intending to share with Dharma Gates is this real sense that the landscape of practice right now in the US is extremely diverse, and there's a lot of creativity happening around how are people going to do this thing. There's sort of been this landing of traditions here, and even just in the communities I've visited, seeing that there's an enormous variation of creative ways of engaging with more traditional views. And what comes to mind is hearing stories about people who make their lives about retreat and about practice, but rather than being a traditional monastic, they go on Goenka retreats and then are a wilderness therapist with the rest of their time, and they just rotate, or things like that really challenge this sense of you're either all in, renunciate on the mountaintop in the Himalayas, or you're just a Joe Schmo layperson, and that there's a lot of interesting middle ground, and not any kind of prescriptive one size fits all thing, really, to that is Buddhism, or American Buddhism. And I think I'm interested personally in trying to help people not shut down their options in terms of how they're looking or interested to engage.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, and yeah, and there are a lot of different kind of hybridizations that are possible for people
Mhm.
in terms of uh, how they proceed on the spiritual path, um, and really none of them are superior to the others, and um, I think it's important for us to be open to those possibilities and not have a purist attitude about the tradition, or about the teaching. Um, the Buddhist tradition has always been evolving and has always been very multifaceted. To some extent, um, there have been situations in which people become specialized, and a collaborative model emerges, where there may be people who are in full-time retreat for years and years and really develop mastery in the realm of meditative practices and contemplative technologies and are just yogis.
Mhm.
And maybe, you could think of the cave yogis in Tibet, or in the Chinese monasteries, the Chinese Chan monasteries, historically, not all of the monks participated in meditation all the time. But there were certain groups of monks who were kind of meditation monks. And
Mhm.
then there were other groups who specialized more in scholarship, and other groups who did work in the garden and grounds, and kind of maintained the monastery, and even other kind of specializations beyond that, and they're all working together,
Mhm.
and working together on the basis of a common vow, a common aspiration. And it's really interesting to kind of ask, what is it that brought them all together? What was the common ground among all of those different groups? Um, and I think now we're also, we have the potential for people to inhabit multiple realms and to be kind of overlapping in terms of how they engage with these different realms, um, and you know in terms of the institutions that exist now, those too are more hybrid in nature, including Great Vow, where I live here. Great Vow Zen Monastery is, in many ways, a Zen Buddhist training monastery. We do a week-long sesshin every month, and do a lot of retreat practice, a lot of meditation, and a lot of ritual. We do daily service in a pretty traditional way, and have a very rigorous schedule, maintain a monastic schedule, and at the same time, people are engaged in a lot of other kind of um, teaching classes outside of the monastery. Or we have a temple in Portland. People are going back and forth between Portland and the monastery, less so now in the time of pandemic. Um, but it's a very porous institution, with a lot of influences flowing in many different directions. And I think the potential for collaborations between academic institutions and monastic institutions, I think there's a lot of potential there. And that's part of what is really exciting to me about Dharma Gates, is that those worlds are kind of coming together, in what y'all are doing. Um, and, that's also a way of kind of bringing these discourses that have become exclusive to some extent, bringing them into conversation with one another, and having humanities scholars who are collaborating with Buddhist monks who are collaborating with neuroscientists, who are collaborating with people who have a large view of global society and kind of living in this time of global crisis, and kind of seeing all these different sides. And we talked before about the Mind and Life Institute and some other efforts to forge these kind of pathways of collaboration. And I see that as a trend that it would be really positive to grow more and more.
Yeah, what comes to my mind, I'm sort of trying to fold this together into some kind of package, but it really seems like there's enough momentum now and happening in this space, in the sort of Mind and Life Institute and sort of contemplative studies field, and in the sort of ways that monastic or contemplative culture is multiplying and experimenting in the US, that I think early on in the sort of landing of Buddhism in the US, there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for the seated practice, and for the this is about the individual and the individual's awakening, and that also it's sort of become clear that the kind of traditional, very intensive sort of Asian monastic practice is pretty hard on a lot of Westerners' nervous systems. And a lot of folks are, a lot of the monasteries in the US have really toned it down a bit compared to how it was in Japan, and in parts of the sort of more intensive meditation cultures. And seeing that there's some, there's the individual in their meditation practice, and then there's also this this process of institution building, or this creative process of being involved in creating a harmonious world that's informed by the Dharma in a lot of different ways. That's not actually an individual endeavor entirely, and that historically there's been a lot of space for lay people to take on roles that support the community, the broader Buddhist community or the monastery, that weren't full-on meditation training. Most people didn't actually do that historically, in my understanding, that it was really a sort of select few of monastics who are really in that role. And so maybe just the sense that that as the sort of way that Buddhism has landed in the US matures, that there's going to be a more clear sense of context for who are the people, and what is the role of people who are really going into retreat, and what does that mean, and what are the other kinds of roles that are available, what are the other kinds of ways to engage or participate in this project that are available to people, that there's a lot of variation, and some of that might be the scholar the scholar side, and some of that might be the at every monastery I've been to, there's usually one or two people who just run everything, like hold the place together, and so that kind of is what comes to mind for me, based on what you shared.
Yeah, and it's good for us to be open, I think, to seeing how the techniques of mind training are themselves evolving, and how we may learn things about consciousness and about the transformation of consciousness, for example, through technological intervention, whether it's kind of psychedelic technology, which obviously has the capacity to transform consciousness in very significant ways, or other kinds of technology. There's a lot of work being done with different forms of brain stimulation that can induce states of mind. So in terms of, at least in terms of kind of altered state experiences, or the states of consciousness that can be accessed through meditation, we're living in a time where people are coming up with all kinds of different ways to access those states. And so how does that fit in with Buddhist practice, and how is that related to meditation? And what is the role of meditative states in the spiritual path more generally? And having a broader, more richly contextualized understanding of meditation is certainly an important part of that. Seeing how meditation has existed within religious contexts historically, and understanding how it has been, how the view of meditation in the modern world has been shaped by certain assumptions and certain expectations. All of that is important. But really, for practitioners, there are a lot of interesting possibilities in terms of how meditation can be engaged with.
What's coming to mind is there's a couple directions that I think it could be interesting to go. One of them is I'm curious what your, if you have a future orientation right now, maybe on both a personal and a kind of collective level, like what's alive for you in your practice and in your sort of general orientation to the future, and what are you excited to be engaging with or moving towards? In a past conversation, you mentioned the possibility of maybe reconsidering the sort of academic approach, but from a very different vantage point now. And I'm curious to hear, it sounds like from the conversation so far, where it's been mostly an opening up of yeah, there's a lot of possibility, and a lot of sort of diversity and openness happening. And I'm curious, like from that space, like what's the direction, what's calling to you?
Yeah, maybe in the academic realm, I mean, there is this trend of contemplative studies programs popping up, and I can see that developing more and becoming more kind of fully infused with the depth of intensive retreat practice and the experience that comes with that. I could see the emergence of institutions outside of academia, that maybe somehow combine elements of retreat experience with Buddhist studies, and maybe forms of global justice activism or eco-sattva action. Within the realm of Buddhist studies, I think just seeing more interaction between the perspective of the practitioner and the perspective of the, let's say, critic of the tradition, or a scholarly perspective that in some ways is operating outside the authority structures of the spiritual tradition. To see more interaction there, I think, would be really fruitful. And then I also think it's really important for us to situate Buddhism within a larger view of the human species on this planet. And that's, that's an endeavor that kind of, includes a lot of other realms of exploration too. But I think, as our kind of view of who we are and what we're doing on this planet evolves, I think our understanding of the wisdom traditions and the traditions that we've inherited within this kind of patriarchal period of human history is also going to change. So that's something that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, this has been an area of interest of me too, and was kind of the subject of my undergraduate thesis work. Is this very interesting event that's happening that I don't think is very widely is not receiving very much attention, but which is that Buddhism and academia, or rather the relationship between religion and the sort of academic institutions, is changing very quickly, as fields like contemplative studies are this sort of merge of science and actually fairly deep engagement increasingly with contemplative traditions, which would historically, like 100 years ago, have fallen in the category of very strongly in religion that academia wants nothing to do with. And so the sort of ivory tower is, in some sense, actually like falling. It is being breached. The sort of complete objectivity or belief in just the sort of pure rationalism is being fractured from multiple angles, and it's coming from a number of different directions. It's not just in the field of contemplative studies, but I find that space very interesting, and I could imagine that there will be deeper engagement in the coming decades between contemplative wisdom, embodied traditions, and the academic world. It seems to be, there's specific institutions and places and departments where that's really happening now, but probably will continue in my view. And I think that's a very significant event, actually. And yeah, and and a lot of what you're sharing is this isn't far away. This is like, there are places where it's really kind of bubbling up already. So I also find it very exciting. But if you don't know what to pay attention to, it's hard to see that anything would be happening. Exactly. But
do you have some examples of places where it's bubbling up?
Oh, I just find like the Mind and Life Institute is a great example, but also the work of Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman, and this sort of there's a number of different pretty powerful, or contemplative studies programs that have a significant amount of momentum, and at pretty reputable institutions. And then what also comes to mind is this sort of, there's the notion you shared of places that are actually outside of academia, because there still are certain constraints on what's able to be talked about in academic spaces based on the sort of, only certain forms of knowledge or only certain ways of arriving at knowledge are respected. The sort of first person inquiry is not really considered valid still, broadly speaking. And so there are, I think in part of this sort of in response to the COVID-19 event, a lot of people started going on Zoom. And one of the things that happened was a lot of communities started meeting and realizing that there wasn't actually any geographic spread or sort of constraints on sharing knowledge and sort of sense making about the world, and that you can actually form functional seminar like environments with like that sort of spread awareness and alternative ways of viewing the world through Zoom, completely outside of academia. And there's a podcast that I think of called the Stoa that is really focused on this, and they've had some heavy hitters like Noam Chomsky and folks on there, but they invite people who would definitely not be invited to an classical academic institution. And they also have a real interest in embodiment and wisdom traditions. And it's not Buddhist, or it's not constrained to any particular space, but I find like the possibility of sort of institutions emerging first, maybe outside of the academic environment, and getting more and more traction and ability to sway culture is already well underway. And so it's sort of like, as you're describing these things, I'm like, yeah, that does seem to be both the sort of changing of academia from the inside, and then also of the growing of different ways of engaging that are outside of academia. Well, we're running. I think we'll move towards wrapping up in the next 10 or so minutes. So maybe if you have, starting to bring things towards a gradual wrapping point, if there's anything still kind of alive or simmering for you from what's been shared so far.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how the spread of Buddhism across the planet, out of Asia, and its kind of slow saturation of the entire planet has been a really transformative event. And I think we have these categories of religion that have developed in the context of European scholarship, shaped by the traditions of Christianity for the most part, kind of colonial era European scholars, Orientalists, Indologists, the kind of invention of world religions in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries has saddled us with these certain kind of conceptual frameworks for thinking about religion. And even the concept of religion itself is a part of that formation. And I think the impact of Buddhism is really calling into question those categories, and really calling into question the view that we have culturally of what religion is. And so I think it is breaking down our kind of view of religion, and then also breaking down the ways that we relate to religion in the material world, in terms of the institutions, as you were saying, that Buddhism has kind of permeated into the scientific realm and the medical realm, and mindfulness is taught everywhere, and to some extent detached from many of the forms that have been a part of Buddhism throughout its history. But it's, and even just the kind of proliferation of like Buddha statues, and that you'll see them in your neighbor's lawn, or outside of a restaurant or whatever. It's that kind of influence, I think, is transforming culture in ways that we're, I think, now beginning to see more vividly. And it's also transforming, what we think of as the kind of most established, most venerable intellectual traditions of Europe and of the Anglophone world, that there's a necessity to engage with the Buddhist tradition within many of the kind of central disciplines of the humanities and within the scientific world. And that kind of engagement is bound to lead to all kinds of creative possibilities.
One way this actually just occurred to me, but I think a very succinct way of putting it is that at the very close to the sort of core of philosophy right now, like in the realm of epistemology and sort of how do we know and how do we think of ourselves in relationship to the world, there's this kind of breakdown of enlightenment thought, and for in a lot of ways our culture has been riding on this sort of undercurrent of this a number of ideas that were the foundation of modernism, and were the sort of the few people who really held together this view of the world that came about in the Enlightenment. And there's this sort of actual, like, the core of that whole mass is kind of dissolving within the academic space in certain ways, like with the sort of work of Francisco Varela and the Mind and Life folks, and it might take a while, like things take a while for them to get from academia out into the broad sort of culture, but that's like, there is this sort of the concepts of religion or not religion, and the story about how world religions, like what they even are, and of ourselves in the world is actually being like rewritten in a certain way. And who knows like what's going to come out in the long term. I loved, I read some of Alan Wallace's stuff in college, and he has this great essay where he proposes that, in the late 20th century or 19th century, the physicists thought they'd basically figured out physics. They thought that it was settled, and that there was this one little problem left, which was the ultraviolet. They called it the ultraviolet catastrophe. And studying that problem led to the sort of creation of the general theory of relativity and quantum theory, which completely reshaped the entire field. And I think Alan Wallace talks about how the study of like concentration, meditation, and the mind through those vehicles might do the same thing. in the same way, where it seems like we're so close and we have this relatively coherent map of the world, but the last little problem of mind is going to change everything. And it becomes hard to actually imagine fully um, what will happen if that transition occurs, if there's other factors like whether civilization continues with climate disruption, but but there's a lot of like interesting unknown there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think that might be a good place to
Yeah.
and just continue into the unknown.
Yeah, I like this. Yeah, let's pause there and wrap. Great.
Thank you.
Wonderful to have you and to talk and get into this stuff. And maybe the very last thing is if you wanted to share anything about yeah, coming to Great Vow, how what's going on there, how could folks get involved, or what's the, we like to sort of give people an invitation with people we're interviewing or hosting to like take this practice a little farther. And so maybe you could share a bit about that.
Yeah, Great Vow is in Northern Oregon. It's north of Portland, founded a little over 20 years ago by Chozen and Hogan Bays, who are the abbots still, married couple. And it's a very supportive place. It's a place where intensive meditation retreat is valued. And it's a place of very strong community. And, it's a warm and loving community. And, it's a very kind of flexible place in many ways. There are younger teachers who are bringing a lot of kind of fresh energy to practice, and there's a lot of openness to kind of trying different things. We're influenced by many different uh, traditions outside of the Soto Rinzai Zen traditions that we inherit formally. So we've had Tibetan and Theravadan teachers come here and lead retreats, and teachers from other traditions, teachers in the kind of realm of non-dual spirituality, and many others. So it's a very, very rich and expansive place to do practice. And it's a much younger community than many Dharma centers and monasteries. And we have a summer program that people can join. And, we're very open to kind of working with people's different financial situations. And people come here for many different periods of time. Some people come just for a week-long retreat, or some people come for a month. Some people come and stay for longer periods of time. It's important to have a supportive community to really go deeper in practice. And this is a place where the leaders are people of integrity. There's a strong commitment to ethics and to transparency, which is really important. And it's a collaborative environment. So there are many different kinds of relationships that coexist here. There's an opportunity for a deep student-teacher relationship, but there are also many other kind of supportive forms of mentorship and just peer relationships, and other kind of forms of community that are supportive. So we'd love to have people from Dharma Gates come through here. We've had many already, and we hope to have more.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing and for talking today. And yeah, we'll end there.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, it's really, I'm sure we'll continue. This will be the last time we talk about these things.
Yep. Yep.